On Too Shortly, Mel Smith is the indecisive owner of Collins Sandwich, bedevilled by flu and a malevolent passenger stuck in a snowdrift for 14 hours. In half an hour, we follow a trail of explosions, intimidations and murder south of the border. And that's here on BBC One. It's now 9 o'clock.
Americans picked the next leader of the Western world. They're still voting, but the experts here say the choice is made. It will be President George Bush.
And in London, the Chancellor is at the centre of a new row over pensioners' benefits. Labour challenged Mr Lawson over what he did or did not say in that much-discussed off-the-record briefing.
Good evening from Washington. Here in 2 hours' time, the states will start counting the votes that will decide who will be the 41st president of the richest and most powerful nation on earth. The opinion polls all say it will be George Bush, but as many as 1 in 5 Americans hadn't made up their minds before today. A thread of hope for Michael Dukakis, who claims to be smelling victory in the air. After a long, bitter and costly campaign, both men can only wait now for America's decision.
Bush's early morning in Houston and the end of a marathon that began here 13 months ago.
It's just at that nervous wreck stage, so we just have to wait and see.
You know, I'm superstitious. I don't talk about it till after polls close.
Bush has crisscrossed the United States with an uphill task to sell a message of continuity that did little to excite the electorate. Soon after sunrise, he was on his way to vote, assured, he said, of 2 votes, his and his wife's. Bush's staff tell him to expect much more than that. The latest opinion surveys still put him out in front, but differ on the size of the winning margin. At campaign headquarters in Houston this morning, he wasn't about to give up.
This is the Vice President. This is George Bush calling you from our headquarters. But they, you know, they've done all this marvelous phone bank work, and all we're doing today is calling people and encouraging them to be sure to vote. It's that critical and that important, and, you know, every vote counts, so I hope we can count on you.
They gave him his send-off last night, a rally at a shopping center in Houston, and a chance to do his last-minute selling. Despite appearances, they haven't used up all their balloons. Most of them are being held back for the victory celebrations they've promised themselves later tonight. This is Tim Sebastian for the 9 o'clock news in Houston.
Tim, George Bush had been trying hard not to appear to be too confident. At this late stage, does he now look like a man who knows he will win?
I think he does know he'll win. He had a few jitters this morning, as you saw, but he has overriding confidence for one reason alone. His campaign throughout has been better financed, better organized by people who've been in power for 8 years in the White House, who know the political game. And what is perhaps surprising about this is not what he's done in the campaign, but what he hasn't had to do. He hasn't had to offer very much in the way of specifics. He's managed to get by cloaking himself in good American values, by associating himself with peace, prosperity, even kindness. And that seems to be something that the voters have appreciated. He looked good, certainly, at his rally last night. He's looking good at the moment, and it looks as though his kind of package is the one that the voters are going to buy.
Tim Sebastian in Houston, thank you. Michael Dukakis, meanwhile, has finally stopped running. In the last 2 days, he covered 8,500 miles, a last-ditch appeal for votes in the marginal states. Tonight, he's back home in Boston, Massachusetts.
The Dukakis plane finally brought the Democrats home to Boston. Behind them, a frantic coast-to-coast tour, which covered more than 3,000 miles in 48 hours. Those gathered on the tarmac here were the loyal campaign workers, the people who looked to Mr. Dukakis to buoy their spirits and tell them they'd win. But the man who's still in second place delivered a lackluster performance.
Today, all over the nation, people will be going to the polls and making their decision. And we await the outcome. And I think that tonight, we're not only going to surprise a few people, but we're going to be doing the celebrating.
The Democrats hope it will be a repeat of the great upset of 1948 when Truman beat the Republicans. As yet, there's no sign of it. If Michael Dukakis can't get a warm welcome here, then he can't get it anywhere. But the reality is that the gap between him and George Bush is still widening. That's how the pollsters see it. Democratic Party workers feel otherwise.
Well, I don't believe the polls. I believe the people. I believe when they go in the booth that they'll vote for Mike Dukakis. And
we remember when Harry Truman was supposed to lose and he won with a landslide. So we believe things can turn around.
He'll still smile for the cameras. This final photo opportunity was at his local polling booth. But Mr. Dukakis has now disappeared, and crowds and police surround his Boston home. He will not reappear until the results are in later tonight. This is Michael Macmillan for the 9 o'clock news in Boston.
The presidential election isn't decided by a simple majority. It's a complex voting system that stacks the odds against Michael Dukakis. In the election, Americans poll state by state, and each state is allocated a number of votes to cast in the Electoral College that chooses the man for the White House. California, the state with the biggest population, has 47 votes. Wyoming, thinly populated, has only 3. Win the state and you get all its votes in the Electoral College. A candidate needs 270 votes to win, and the Republicans have a big advantage. These states seem certain to go Republican, giving George Bush a bedrock of 154 Electoral College votes. But Dukakis can only count on 6 states, and so only 48 votes. So Bush seems more than halfway to victory before the key states, those that are not so predictable, are counted. The opinion polls say most of them, too, look like going his way.
Typically, a presidential election expresses the will of only about half the people. That's how many vote. And there's every sign of another low turnout today. The voters are not inspired by either candidate. And as for the Electoral College...
You're asking me? I don't know. I have the faintest idea.
Electoral College. How about something like maybe where they teach somebody how to elect?
Americans are mystified, but so far it hasn't mattered.
If the Electoral College vote and the popular vote didn't go the same way, there'd be a constitutional crisis. That hasn't happened in a modern election. And what this system does is focus the campaign on a very few battleground states.
Good morning, Ohio.
Ohio, with 23 Electoral College votes, is one of them, and the winner will take all. One thing all candidates are agreed on is how much they love Ohio.
This state is critical. You give me this state, and you're looking at the next president of the United States.
And candidates don't travel alone, but have other candidates with them for House and Senate seats. It's called the coattails effect. It worked for Ronald Reagan in 1980, but not in 1984. Now on what he calls his sunset tour. He's coming one more time to the aid of the party.
Now, my fellow Californians, I want to ask you to do me one small favor. Will you go out there and win one for the Gipper?
Despite the enthusiasm, they probably won't win quite enough for the Gipper. Congress is solidly Democratic today and likely will be tomorrow. Americans have a habit of ticket splitting, voting for a president of one party and a Congress of the other.
Well, I think the American people really are a little leery about giving complete control over to either party. It's a little checks and balance system.
And there are not only candidates on the ballots, there are issues. In Maryland, a proposed ban on the sale of new handguns. The gun lobby has spent millions of dollars trying to scare the voters into opposing it. At least it's over, or nearly over, and on the west front of the Capitol, they're building the platform for the inauguration of the 41st President of the United States.
And nobody here seems to think that they're building it for anybody but George Bush. Daniel Shaw is one of America's leading political commentators. What would Michael Dukakis have to do today to upset the polls and win?
Well, Michael, we know for an absolute fact that Dukakis is losing big in several small states, in the South and the mountain states. So in order to win, he'd have to win small in some very big states. The Electoral College that we just had explained to us means that it doesn't matter by how many he wins in these states, he gets each state if he wins. he must, to win, have states like California, he must have Illinois, he must have Ohio, he must have New York, he must have Pennsylvania. That's what he needs.
It sounds like he needs to take almost all of those big marginal states.
If he loses any one of the big eastern states, the industrial states, he will certainly have lost. You can count already the number of electoral votes which nobody even thinks are in question. And therefore, he knows, everybody knows, that it would take a miracle to pull out now by winning all the states where he has any chance at all.
Do you think that miracle, there's any possibility whatsoever of that miracle happening? You've had your ear to the ground today.
I've had my ear to the ground today, and there's a lot of exit poll results we're not supposed to be reporting until later on, but which indicate that something is happening that makes them worry, and that is that the Democratic turnout early today has been very heavy, and that in some states where the caucus is supposed to lose, he was getting more votes than Bush early. Didn't mean that he'll end up with more votes at the end when the Republicans wake up and go out to do their polling. But it does mean there is still maybe a 1 in 100 chance that there could be the greatest upset, and that tomorrow people who have already put in type that Bush is the next president might have to change their type.
Daniel Shaw, thanks very much indeed. Well, we'll know for sure if it is to be President Bush in just a few hours. Meanwhile, at home, the Chancellor is at the centre of a new row over what he did or didn't say about means testing for pensioners' benefits. Martin Lewis in London.
Thank you, Michael. The Labour Party are challenging the Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, over what he told journalists about his plans for pensioners' benefits. Mr. Lawson has described newspaper reports of his briefing as the most inaccurate, half-baked and irresponsible of any he'd read in 10 years as a minister. But tonight, some of the journalists involved provided their own account of the briefing, and that prompted Labour's Gordon Brown to table a series of Commons questions, challenging the Chancellor to publish a full transcript of the conversation.
After a briefing by the Chancellor at 11 Downing Street, Sunday newspaper journalists wrote at the weekend that Nigel Lawson was now in favour of more means testing of benefits, including those paid to pensioners. As a result, the Labour leader, Neil Kinnock, challenged Mr. Lawson in the Commons. The Chancellor dismissed the reports as inaccurate, half-baked and irresponsible, and then announced there would be more help for older, poorer pensioners to be financed by extra money. He later insisted there was no Treasury record of that briefing.
I'll tell you who did take a record, and that is the journalists themselves. And if they look in their notebooks, if they're honest, they will see that there is nothing in their notebooks to stand up the stories that they published.
Tonight, Labour's Treasury spokesman Gordon Brown has inherited a transcript put together by a group of the journalists at Friday's briefing, which paints a different picture. Mr. Brown has tabled parliamentary questions to the Chancellor, and he's written to him direct, asking whether he had said, first, clearly there is a case for restructuring the child benefit system with more means testing. Second, that only a minority of pensioners cannot afford to make ends meet. And third, that targeting special help for those most in need is the way we are likely to go, the implication being means testing to cover all benefits.
What is new are the accounts that are appearing tonight and tomorrow morning in very specific terms from journalists who were present at the briefing with the Chancellor. And they raise very clear questions about what the Chancellor said about child benefit, about pensions and about means testing generally. The Chancellor challenged the journalists to open the notebooks. They've done that. Now the Chancellor must answer the questions that they have put to him.
In the Commons this afternoon, the Prime Minister was pressed to say whether she supported the view that only a minority of pensioners had difficulty coping.
Does the Prime Minister agree with the Chancellor's view that only a small minority of pensioners have difficulty in making ends meet? Or is she as ashamed as him as she should be?
If it had not been for the excellent stewardship of my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, we should not now have the highest standard of social services, including pensions, that this country has ever known.
Tonight's developments come just when the government thought the pressure of recent days was off, with the House of Lords this afternoon approving proposals to abolish free dental and eye tests, having rejected the idea last July. A few moments ago, the Treasury said they had no record of Friday's briefing at 11 Downing Street. It may be that the Chancellor will simply refuse to answer Mr. Brown's questions for that reason, but he must respond to the parliamentary questions, making certain that this issue, the government's long-term thinking on benefits and means testing, will remain high on the Commons agenda.
The Citizens Advice Bureau say many people are worse off because of social security benefit changes. They say new figures show that means-tested benefits have made 80% of poor families poorer. The social security system was overhauled in April to target the most needy.
The biggest shake-up in the welfare state since it was created was meant to target money towards the poorest who need it most, but it hasn't worked, according to the Citizens Advice Bureau. Their survey shows that half of the people seeking advice don't understand the system. Most of those who apply for loans to buy things like furniture and cookers don't get them. Family credit, seen by the government as the jewel in the crown of the new system, doesn't reach a third of those eligible. And even where people are getting more money under new means-tested benefits, they're losing more than they gain because they now have to pay for things like school meals and rates. 8 out of 10 claimants believe they've lost out overall.
If you define the people who really are in need as people who previously were on the supplementary benefit system, which was that essential safety net, a large proportion of those people are worse off under the new system of income support than they were previously. So if that is targeting, what you have is some very surprising results because poor people are feeling less secure financially than they were before.
There's more bureaucracy involved in the new system, and MPs say they've been inundated with mail from people who've lost out. Families, disabled people and pensioners.
These are genuinely needy people, and the present system has not only not helped them, in some cases it's harmed them. And I think that's a totally unacceptable result, and I don't believe it was intended either.
Ministers say the survey is not the real picture, as it was done only weeks after the new system came into place. But the survey's finding that targeted benefits don't work is an embarrassment to the government during the current row over suggestions that pensions too should be targeted.
The Parliamentary Ombudsman is to investigate the Department of Trade and Industry's handling of the Barlow Klaus affair. The Ombudsman, Sir Anthony Barlow, had been asked by MPs to investigate complaints from investors who lost money when the company's funds collapsed.
The Ombudsman, who said tonight he'd urgently seek the Department of Trade's comments on their handling of Barlow Klaus, has no power of his own to order compensation. But the 18,000 investors who lost up to £190 million when Barlow Klaus crashed know that government departments have often acted on his findings, and will see today's announcement as renewed hope they'll get some, if not most, of their money back. Last month's report of an internal DTI inquiry chaired by Sir Godfrey Lekain was hailed by the government as proof that it had acted properly. But Sir Godfrey said he hadn't been considering blame or the way people had acted. Trade Secretary Lord Young said at the time that the government wouldn't compensate investors. Now, though, it's thought his department may be ready to contribute to a lifeboat fund put together by city institutions. Investors now see another alternative, says their lawyer.
They certainly were concerned at Lord Young's statement, which was seemed quite inconsistent with the facts revealed by Lekain. But of course, now they can take heart again because the matter is now going to be investigated by someone who's quite impartial.
Labour MP Alf Morris, one of the many who approached the Ombudsman on behalf of constituents, welcomed tonight's announcement. Labour's trade spokesman wants government action before the Ombudsman's report.
I would certainly urge, even now, Lord Young and his ministers to organise compensation arrangements for investors who've suffered. It's not good enough to leave it to city institutions. There's no sign yet that any such voluntary organisation will succeed, and I think the responsibility of government and of ministers is to make sure that they organise the compensation to which investors are entitled.
Ombudsman's inquiries can take up to 3 years, but it's known that Sir Anthony Barlow wants this one concluded speedily.
Israeli police have kicked and beaten a 60-year-old man in fierce clashes with Israeli Arab protesters. The violence flared in the town of Taiba, that's close to the border of the occupied West Bank, but in Israel itself.
Today's violence has particular significance because these are not Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. They are Israeli Arabs living inside Israel and theoretically with the same rights as the majority Jewish population. The Arabs were protesting at the destruction of 15 houses the authorities say were built without proper permits. The Arabs say they're being discriminated against.
This is the democracy of Mr. Shamir and Mr. Perez of the Likud and the Ma'araq. The Ma'araq, the party of the workers.
So far, Israel's Arab population has stayed largely aloof from the clashes on occupied territory. But scenes like this, a 60-year-old Arab man being arrested after a verbal exchange with the police, will do nothing to quiet Israeli Arab fears about their future, as the right-wingers and extremists attempt to put together an Israeli government that would appear to have little sympathy for the Palestinians, be they Israeli citizens or not.
An earthquake in China, which struck over the weekend, is now feared to have killed more than 900 people. The earthquake demolished several towns and villages in Yunnan province near China's border with Burma. It's a remote, mountainous area, which makes rescue efforts difficult.
Almost all the buildings in Lanchang County, with its population of 400,000 Tibetan Burmese Buddhists, have been destroyed, along with homes in neighbouring counties. Built on stilts to give them ground clearance in the region's heavy rains, the houses crumbled as the earth shook. It's the worst earthquake to hit China since almost 250,000 people died in 1976, though unofficial figures suggested that 750,000 people had perished. This weekend's quake registered 7.6 on the Richter scale, the effects officially described as just short of catastrophic. It was followed by about 40 aftershocks. One report said that the area had ample food and water supplies, but its main road link to the outside world had been cut. Troops have now arrived to help in the rescue.
50 people are reported dead in the Philippines after another typhoon named Skip. The storm largely missed the capital Manila, but elsewhere landslides and flooding made more than 100,000 homeless. Rescue workers say floodwaters reached roof level in some places, power has been cut, and poor communications with the remote areas mean the toll of casualties could be much higher. The driver of a fuel tanker involved in a motorway pileup which killed 13 people a year ago has been cleared of blame. The accident on the M61 in Lancashire was one of the worst ever on a British motorway.
The accident happened in perfect visibility. A fuel tanker driven by David Dawson from Bury smashed into the back of stationary traffic on the M61 near Preston. Several vehicles were engulfed in a fireball, and of the 13 people who died, 6 were from one family. Witnesses had said the tanker was travelling too fast as it approached the queue, and they claimed the driver may even have dozed off. But Dawson maintained an accident was unavoidable when a car cut in front of him as he drove along at 30 miles an hour. It took the jury at Preston Crown Court 27 hours to reach a majority verdict. Not guilty on both charges of death by reckless driving. As Dawson left the court, he was too distressed to talk.
His faith in British justice has been vindicated by the decision of this court today.
Dawson, who was badly injured in the crash, returned to his home in Bury tonight to continue his recovery.
The Attorney General, Sir Patrick Mayhew, has defended the heavily criticised Crown Prosecution Service against charges that it's not working properly because it's understaffed and underfunded. The service has the final say on whether criminal cases go to court, but many policemen feel that because of its shortcomings, it's slow to act and too reluctant to prosecute.
In the 2 years since it's been operating in England and Wales, the Crown Prosecution Service has never had enough lawyers to do the vital work of reviewing criminal cases. The problem is particularly bad in London, where defence solicitors like Tony Edwards are paid higher rates to appear in court because local prosecutors have been able to recruit little more than half the lawyers they need.
They obviously have an enormous recruitment difficulty, as do all of us who work as criminal lawyers in London. That means that the caseloads on individual lawyers within the service are very heavy, and that undoubtedly has meant that some cases would not be reviewed as thoroughly as they may be in a perfect world.
Some lawyers, magistrates and senior police officers maintain that the system is now working well. But the Metropolitan Police Federation, representing junior ranks in London, says that the prosecution service is throwing out cases it might have won in court. Martin Smith, a special constable as well as a solicitor, advises a number of police officers.
They're very demoralised by the fact that they do their job under very difficult circumstances. They present the evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service only to see it thrown away, watered down, or simply the case doesn't go forward at all and justice isn't done.
Of course, a police officer will be disappointed and even resentful, and wholly understandably. But what is the purpose of the Crown Prosecution Service? It was set up by Parliament following a royal commission to provide an independent legal review of every case that is charged by a police officer. Now, there has to be enough evidence before somebody can properly be made the subject of criminal proceedings, prosecuted. Because otherwise, as the Royal Commission said, it's unfair on the citizen and it is a waste of the resources of the court.
Polish workers at 2 small yards in Gdansk have defied the Solidarity leader Lech Wałęsa and gone on strike. Wałęsa has refused to back strikes called to protest at government plans to close the Lenin shipyard. He's threatened to resign if the strike spread. Around 400 men walked out at a repair yard and 30 took over the gates of another small yard. Doctors in Japan are closely monitoring the Emperor Hirohito tonight after his condition deteriorated earlier today. The 87-year-old emperor has been gravely ill since the middle of September when he collapsed with internal bleeding. Today his condition was stabilized with drugs and further blood transfusions. It's thought he's suffering from cancer of the pancreas. The Prince of Wales in Paris spent part of the day looking at the city's architecture, classic and modern, and whatever his views privately, the only word he was heard to say was remarkable. The Princess of Wales had a separate engagement visiting AIDS patients, and tonight the royal couple have been having dinner on a boat on the River Seine.
Considering the attacks the Prince of Wales has made on modern architecture, it was a brave decision to invite him to see the most controversial building in all of France. The Arche de la Défense is a 35-story office block nearing completion on the edge of Paris. The architect is now dead, but the arguments about his extraordinary building continue. The prince, surrounded by the project leaders, showed a diplomatic interest. Earlier, at a reception in Paris, he told his audience how his remarks about architecture in Britain had created an interesting row. He went on, "I wouldn't dream of doing so here in France, but 1 or 2 people have already said they would be interested to hear my views, but only in private." The prince was still giving little away when the mayor of Paris, Jacques Chirac, showed him around an urban redevelopment project in Montparnasse. But this was clearly more